Our next session is all about fostering collaboration with regulators and government. And on the panel, we have Michael, International Head of Public Policy for Bloc. We've got Dr. Daniel Molino, Member for Fraser, and Rhonda Luo, Policy Director for the ABA. And moderating the panel, we've got Hannah Glass from King & Wood Mallesons. Welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the panellists and to the audience for all being here today. So, today we're talking about something which is probably close to the heart of a lot of people in FinTech, and that is collaboration with regulators and collaboration with government, because, of course, financial services and laws are at the heart of so much of what we do. But if we're actually looking at this and how you can actually navigate and improve your business, you kind of need to think about regulators and government. So, Michael, why don't we start with you, and just a bit of a question. We have a fair few regulators in this country. How do you go about navigating that sort of regulatory soup, perhaps?
It's a good question. I think if you're a small fintech, it can be quite daunting, I think, to navigate and understand who the right stakeholders are to talk to. I think fortunately we're very lucky in Australia that a lot of the regulators have for quite some time been, in recognition of the fact that it can be difficult for smaller organisations, have established teams that are there to connect with fintechs and help fintechs understand the regulatory landscape and what the potential regulatory obligations might be. A bit of hand-holding as well. This has happened across jurisdictions. So the UK, I think, early on did a very good job in setting up structures and frameworks for this. But actually, I think Australia's overtaken the UK in many respects, and we're definitely punching above our weight when it comes to that kind of engagement by regulators and industry. I think FinTech Australia, obviously, as the industry association for fintechs, is a really important part of that as the connective tissue between the membership and the regulators. But equally, I think Treasury plays a really critical role here as well as the central government agency that coordinates across different policy settings and making sure that, a whole of government approach is being considered and taken where necessary. I think one of the challenges actually in any regulatory structure is you do get regulators that are focused on their own mandate. And although, again, we're very lucky in Australia that we have the Twin Peaks regulatory model where you have a conduct regulator like ASIC across all of financial services. But equally, there are other issues that do pop up. And I think having Treasury play that role, and they do play that role really well. Our experience in dealing with Treasury on a range of policy issues has been really positive. And when I compare that to the experience we have in dealing with the Treasury departments or their equivalents in other jurisdictions, Australia compares really favourably, actually, in terms of the level of engagement, the level of knowledge, and the willingness to collaborate and talk to industry. So I think there's a number of ways that regulators have set up for that, but also I think using the industry associations like FinTech Australia is a really critical part of that too.
Plug for FinTech Australia right there. In this audience, I kind of expect that though. But that is a really interesting point that you raise, which is we kind of know how to speak to and how to get into the front door if you're a small business, and there are ways and means of doing that. Rhonda, I'm going to ask you, you're obviously at the Australian Banking Association. Banks are generally not small businesses. What is the experience of banks and other large organisations in navigating this?
So a lot of ABA members are very large companies, but also there are a large number of mutual banks in Australia that do serve the communities well, and they can be reasonably small businesses, so we do need to think about the range of banks when we say banking. I would say as banks, we do probably see, I would say, the full range of regulators across most of the economy, not just the Twin Peaks regulators, but also obviously quite intense spotlight on competition from the ACCC, privacy from the OEIC, and so on and so forth. And then in providing banking services to our clients, banks also need to be very mindful about what regulations our clients are subject to across health, telcos, and etc. What I would say as a concept and a proposal for government and regulators is what works well is when we sit down at the table, have a constructive conversation about what are we trying to achieve, what are the objectives, and once we've got that common understanding, that common problem statement, then suddenly a lot of other pieces start to fall into place in terms of what is this regulator's role, how do they contribute to that objective or that common solution, and what is another regulator's role and how can they work together to achieve that. I would say probably cybersecurity and this morning's conversation about scams are two really good examples. Both are problems that, are in many ways hitting Australia from overseas crime syndicates and criminals. We can't just ban our way out of this. We can't write a law saying no more cybercrime, no more scams. But instead we see some really good work being done by the government and regulators in coming together in the Critical Infrastructure Centre or the NASC to say how can we lift capability across the industry? Where can we lead? Where can we provide guidance? Where can we support by providing capability rather than simply going out there and enforcing your way out of a problem?
It's a really interesting idea when we say, we talk about this and we talk about policy and law, and realistically the result is frequently laws which then need enforcement. How can we then, obviously working collaboratively, there are solutions, but how can we deal with this when it's a bit more of a subtle solution which doesn't require enforcement? Rhonda?
I would come back to what is the outcome that we're trying to achieve. So again, coming back to maybe cyber as something that the ABA has been pretty engaged on. There's almost it's almost like you take it as any, a business solving a problem. What is the problem? What is the end state that you want to get to? So I had a conversation this morning with people at the conference, and we described, the goal, really fixating on the goal in the way that a 4-year-old would fixate on how do you get to endless ice cream. So what is the goal? What is your definition of endless ice cream? How do we get there? And then there's probably a defensive element of building up our cyber defences and technology. And then there's almost like the proactive element of how do we almost leapfrog over existing problems that are creating cyber and data weaknesses to get to a better end state, the ice cream. I guess I think we all have some idea of what it means to be building up your defences and preventing weaknesses and anticipating in quantum computing. But in terms of the proactive element, one thing that the ABA has been really keen to have a conversation about is something like digital ID. It's kind of in a way leapfrogging over all the problems with analogue identity, copies of documents going everywhere. It enables a whole range of digital services and capabilities. And in a way, it's kind of agnostic as between, incumbents and competitors and new entrants, because it's something that lifts the entire economy and benefits everyone.
So scams can be solved with new technological solutions, perhaps?
I think that's part of it, but we also come back to the human. Like, you can't design a technology without thinking about who's using it, what are the human fallibilities, and what are the human strengths. So I could go into endless stuff about AI, but I won't.
Well, I think that's a really good segue into, Daniel, I'd love to bring you into the conversation here, because obviously this is something that is key to government, because government has a role to play in facilitating these solutions. So how do you see government playing a part in fixing this?
Well, I think that the points that Rhonda was just making were really well made, that I think when you're designing regulation, you should have an objective or an outcome clearly in mind. And if you look at some of the mechanisms that government has set up, so for example, regulatory impact statements are one example that is used at many levels of government to try and assess whether regulation is well designed or fit for purpose. I would just note, though, that in practice it can actually be quite difficult. So, for example, if you look at something like scams, I think we would all agree that the objective is to minimise scams. But when you think about things like, for example, how much compensation should be payable and by who, where scams exist, you very quickly get into really tricky areas like moral hazard, or the incentives on banks, for example, or other players, whether they be telcos, to invest in the appropriate technology. And so very quickly we get into, I think, very tricky discussions around what the right mechanisms are, and often very difficult to assess before the fact. So I think we start out with clearly defined objectives, but in practice it can actually be very difficult to assess. I think there's a second class of challenges, and in one of my roles, I'm chair of the House Economics Committee. We're undertaking an inquiry into competition at the minute, and so we had a bunch of big tech companies before us yesterday, so Apple and Google and Amazon. But if you look at some of these companies, it's very clear to me that there is significant consumer benefit from a lot of the innovation they have created over the last 20 years. And yet there's also potential for a lot of consumer harm. So there are parts of their value chain where there's arguably market power. There are potentially, in some areas, the risk of certain types of behaviour like self-preferencing. And without getting into all the details, because I'm sure the audience knows a lot more about this than me, but the reason I raise this is that at a very fundamental level, when we're dealing with how should government think about regulation in some of these areas, we deal with a trade-off that I think exists in a lot of areas that people in this room act in, which is a consumer harm versus innovation trade-off that I think is extremely difficult to think through when you're thinking about regulation. And there are trade-offs there that aren't easy to boil down to, I think there's a certain outcome I want to achieve, because sometimes different people can land at different ways in which we should resolve that trade-off. And they're not easy to arrive at through a RIS or something mechanical like that. And the only other thing I would say is that the other challenge, I think, which regulators often face in trying to design regulation, and I suppose an example here for me is AI, is that we're in a broad sense aware of certain risks that we might be trying to manage, but it's so dynamic and we feel so far behind the game. We're really trying to design regulation in an environment where by the time whatever regulation we're designing comes in, we know the situation is going to be very different, and probably different to what we anticipated it might be. And so I'd just say that there are many situations, I think, in which there's a complexity but also a dynamism in the world, which I think adds a great deal of difficulty to the regulatory challenge.
And I think that's something which a lot of people have been grappling with, particularly as the pace of change from a technological perspective certainly outstrips the speed at which we can actually work through a regulatory process. What is the right approach then? Is there a way that we can sort of tweak our regulatory process to better accommodate for that pace of change?
Well, so, I mean, going back to the title of this session, I think collaboration is key. So I think government, but also regulators, need to be collaborating with the sector so as to get the best possible understanding. That doesn't always mean we're going to be on the same page, but I think we've got to firstly start from the position that not all the knowledge on these areas is in Canberra, and it's certainly not in Parliament House, and it's not in a regulator. So for me, I've always found that the most effective departments and the most effective ministers are those that are constantly reaching out. So I would certainly start with collaboration as the key. I suppose one approach that I think is useful is this notion of regulatory sandpits, or however you want to phrase it, where you see a risk emerging, maybe you start with something that's a bit of a halfway house, or a no regrets approach as the first approach, and expecting that you might need to go further or flesh that out. So I think that's a sensible approach. We have a bit of that in Australia already. ASIC does some of that. I know other countries are possibly a bit more advanced. And I suppose the other thing I would say is, and this is something that Michael alluded to, is this notion of collaboration between regulators. The regulatory grid has been raised with my committee by many, many stakeholders across many sectors. It's been something which, as an advisor, I heard about back in 2012, I think. But I think that notion of government thinking about complex problems in particular from a more holistic sense, but even with simpler regulatory problems, trying to fit them into the broader scheme so that we're not putting in place regulatory changes in a haphazard way.
I think it's a very...
So add to that?
Yeah, go for it.
So I think another way of tackling some of these very complex and changing problems is maybe going back to your question about how do we write regulation and how specific does regulation need to be versus being, I think something that Australia is very good at is being principles-based and articulating the objective. And I think we can do a lot with our capability these days of measuring and using data and I guess quantifying the problem, where the problem lies, what are the hotspots, and then maybe saying this is the goal that we want to get to. So I suppose maybe that's a difference between a regulator saying I want a business to implement this particular technology or have a particular process which can be very quickly overtaken by technology and the smartness of criminals versus saying I want you to, as a start, benchmark how well you're doing preventing financial crime, for example, or cyber attacks against industry peers and benchmarking how well an industry is doing against another industry sector. And once you start to have that information in a, maybe starting with a non-regulatory approach, like a collaborative non-enforcement approach, once we have the data, I find a lot of the time that really focuses the conversation and people start to go, okay, I can see there's a problem. This is how we can solve it today, but I can also see it can be worked around in a particular way in 3 years' time, so how do we future-proof a major technology investment?
That's a really important way to think about it, which is not just now but into the future. And a non-regulatory approach, Michael, that sounds a little bit like some of the aspects of Block and particularly Afterpay's business in terms of the evolution of regulation for you.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think I would make a couple of points here. I think the first is that we should really try and avoid letting the perfect be the enemy of the good when it comes to regulation. I think things like the Buy Now Pay Later Code, which was established after a Senate inquiry in 2019, recommended that there should be a code. There would be some stakeholders, no doubt, out there who would say that the code is not perfect, and it's certainly not perfect, but is it a good step that the industry has taken? Absolutely, and it enhances the protections for consumers in a really meaningful way. Does it go far enough? Well, that's a question that should be asked, but I think we should not let questions like that, I think, get in the way of industry taking steps like that to make sure that they're addressing and responding to potential risks out there in the community. I think the other thing that's really important, and I think builds on what Daniel and Rhonda have said, is that I think we need evidence when it comes to policy making, and really good evidence. And I think one thing that regulators can do, and they have done, is when they do a report or a review of an industry or a product, they gather a lot of evidence from market participants, and they've got the ability to publish a report which goes into what the consumer outcomes are. What are we seeing? What is the data telling us? Where are the potential problems? And also, what are the potential solutions to these problems? Do we have existing regulatory approaches that could respond to these problems? Do we think we need new regulatory approaches? What might they be? And I think that sort of evidence gathering and public reporting can play a really useful role in helping shape debate, and also help make sure that regulators are staying close to emerging trends and understanding what the impacts of those trends are on consumers. Because I think it's easy when you have new technology for people to get worried about what might be in the media or what anecdotal information is being presented. You see it now with AI. People are coming up with sort of weird and wonderful examples about the impact of AI, but what do we actually know about the impact of AI? Well, that will be based on what the evidence tells us, and I think that evidence gathering and public reporting is really critical, because it helps ensure that we are taking an evidence-based approach to policy making and making sure that we're still outcomes focused as well.
So regulators obviously do a lot of that, but industry does as well, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of the engagement and collaboration that happens between industry and government is when government is asking questions about policy settings, having industry, whether that's through FinTech Australia, whether that's through the Tech Council, any other industry association, working together to identify what solutions should be adopted is really critical. Because I think part of the risk in all of this is when government is thinking about regulatory reform, industry, I think, sometimes ends up in a position of saying, well, we don't want that, and we don't want that, and we think there's a problem with this. but not proactively suggesting solutions that could work. And I think this is where industry can step up and play a really important role. And we see a lot of that already, actually, but I think it's really important for industry to maintain that focus on helping solve the problem, or if the problem is not well defined, making sure the problem is better defined as well.
And Daniel, as someone in government, how do you react when, say, for example, you do have an industry group that comes to you and says, I know you asked us X, but actually that doesn't work? How do you work through that process from a government and a policy perspective?
Well, look, I think if somebody makes that kind of assertion about something not working, I think it's definitely worth looking at. I guess going back to the points that Michael was raising, I think there's a growing acknowledgement in government that we need to get better at measuring things and evaluating things. So, for example, if you go back to the COVID period, if you look at the previous government, which rolled out a lot of compensation and fiscal stimulus, and the majority of that was supported on a bipartisan basis. But what struck me at that time was how much government started to reach out to the private sector, whether it be the banks or the credit card companies, or indeed some of the companies at this forum, to get daily tracking of how money was being spent by different demographics. Now, that wasn't data that the ABS was collecting with that kind of regularity at the time, but I think in a very sensible and pragmatic way, government sought that data and then used that to inform how it would roll money out to people. Now, that was a time where government was willing to do that because the threats were so extreme, but to me it was a good example of where the ABS is an amazing organisation and I think stacks up well compared to any national Bureau of Statistics in the world. But the reality is there's also a lot of other data out there, and I think governments need to be open to getting data from a wide range of sources. And then the question is what you do with it. And I think that's where we come to, for example, the creation of the Evaluator General Office, which I think is really important because I think we need to be open to much more rigorous ways of evaluating regulation, but also what government does, for example, through social programs. And I think at times we have fallen back on what you might call cookie cutter approaches like cost benefit analysis or plugging numbers into some kind of mechanistic approach. I think we need to be more open to using a whole bunch of much more rigorous and bespoke processes. I mean, this goes back to, I suppose, my academic background, where I feel like there's a lot of techniques out there that we could use that are more rigorous to evaluate the impacts of regulation. And then I suppose it's not just evaluating as much as you can in the lead up to designing regulation, but then building into regulation, say, an evaluation after 1 or 2 or 3 years, and then using that as a prompt for does it need to be refreshed.
And that sort of leads us to one of the comments in the intergenerational report that was released last week was that government should provide regulation and rules that are both stable and flexible, which kind of seems like a bit of an oxymoron. So would that be one of the ways that it could be achieved in terms of those regular reviews? And if so, how can that be built? Is there a way to build that into the legislation and the reform process so that it can be acted upon?
Yeah, I think that's right. And my dissertation actually was on the macroeconomic impacts of an ageing society, which I feel is now being kind of brought back to me every 5 years through the intergenerational report. But what I would say, and I suppose in some ways it reflects what you've just said, is that I think government should do absolutely everything it can to get the best possible forecasts of what Australia will look like in 10, 20 and 40 years. But it should do so knowing it is almost certainly going to be quite wrong on the 20 and 40 year estimates, because even with the very best models you can possibly generate, and this isn't a government problem, this is exactly the same in academia and the private sector. I mean, once you move beyond 10 years with anything of any complexity, the error bounds become so huge. So I guess my feeling is you need things like the intergenerational report to keep you on your toes when it comes to government programs that are potentially spiralling out of control. But you've also got to have the humility and the realism to say, beyond a certain time frame, we've got to be very careful about how much faith we place on the median or modal projection. And so we have to build in constant updating based on new data as it comes in. So I think it's exactly that kind of sentiment that you need to build into major regulation.
I mean, just to add to that, I think, 10 years ago, buy now, pay later did not exist. 10 years ago, people were not using smartphones for contactless payments. There are a whole range of things that can happen in the next 10 years that we can't predict, to Daniel's point. And I think this is why having regulators stay close to industry is so critical, because when things do change, sometimes it's a little bit like you can't tell that they're changing, or you can't tell that the trend is going in a particular direction so strongly. So the fact that, a lot of consumers have switched from credit cards to buy now, pay later, for example, is a huge trend that is now clearly visible, but it wasn't necessarily apparent at the time. And, the fact that people are now only leaving home with their smartphone as opposed to leaving home with a full wallet of plastic is something that's kind of feels like it's crept up on us, but now it's very clear and palpable, actually, that this is now a very, significant shift in consumer behaviour that needs to be thought about. And I think one of the benefits, actually, of these parliamentary committees that exist is that perhaps unlike the legislative process that can be slow and a bit unpredictable, these committees can play a really important role in gathering information, bringing people to provide evidence and debating issues in a way that can be quite agile, actually, as compared to other mechanisms that are available. And that public debate is really important, because it means that all of the stakeholders in that ecosystem, whether it's industry, whether it's regulators, will pay attention to what is being debated and make sure that they're keeping across the emerging issues of the day.
Well, I guess for me that also comes back to how do you articulate the objectives of regulation and legislation. So I guess in your two examples of buy now, pay later and the move to mobile kind of transactions and mobile wallets, one thing that one consumer group said to the ABA recently that really stuck with me was, yes, we agree these things are happening and we accept that change is happening. What is really important for their clients was the man on the or the person on the street is starting to see a lot of complexity in the way they can pay, the different ways to pay, and how much protection they get when they pay with a card versus a wallet versus, as we move into pay to and other things. And that, for them, from the consumer group's perspective, came back to what is the level of consumer protection that needs to be provided for in Australia. I don't think we have an answer to that. I think that's maybe one of the issues that we can start to tease out through the payments reform process. But it's maybe that also, to me, illustrates the importance of knowing what we're trying to do. So is it to provide for innovation? Is it to maintain a level of consumer protection? Is it about resilience in the payment system, or is it about efficiency in payments? And you can't achieve all of those at once, particularly as between regulators. But if we start to say this is really, really important and we need to absolutely get to this, and maybe we can have we can look at a trade-off between these two other things, maybe that then also helps to kind of tell us how to interpret the data, what is really important to look at in inquiry, for example.
So if we're looking at this inquiry, and I may jump to payments very quickly because obviously it's a clear area of interest in this conference, do you think that we are on the right path with the current consultations?
I think all the right questions are being asked. I think one of the challenges that people in industry probably feel is that there's a lot of change on the law reform agenda, and different parts of the industry will have different priorities, and I think there may be frustration around the sequencing and around the pace at which the change is happening. And I think it's understandable, and it's something that we have to grapple with. But I think there's no doubt the complexity of the financial services world that we're living in is a driver of that. There's no sort of getting around the fact that there's complexity, but there's also innovation and how we sort of make sure that that we're promoting innovation, allowing innovation to occur without leaving behind consumers who may be vulnerable is a really important question that I think needs ongoing focus. But I think, there's a lot happening, and industry is would say that they're very keen for that to continue and continue at pace.
Well, firstly, can I say, as an unbiased observer, the government's doing a fantastic job with its consultation. No,
As I'm sure everyone here agrees.
Yeah, the point I wanted to add is that, look, I think for me, to the extent that I've been exposed through the House Economics Committee to some of these issues, yeah, there really is a tension here at times between consumer protection and innovation, and for me, that's a really tricky one. But I just wanted to add that in addition to that overarching tension, even within consumer protection, it's not like we're kind of trying to look at consumers as a homogenous group, which I think sometimes bureaucrats and politicians can also be guilty of. But, when I go to my electorate, and now I put my local member hat on, the bottom half of my electorate is very highly educated, professional, Footscray, Seddon, Yarraville. They're the people who are leaving home without a George Costanza wallet full of cards, and they're okay with what's going on. In the top northern half of my electorate, there are many 70-year-old migrants, some of whom can barely speak English. They're threatened by cheques being abandoned by the payment system. They want to make many payments in cash. And when we tried to place limits on cash payments, as you might remember a few years ago, there was a very quick and resounding pushback from parts of my electorate. So even within that consumer protection component of what we're looking at, I think it's actually much more nuanced than sometimes you might imagine if you were kind of just putting out a very high-level government discussion paper. And I feel that very much from talking to people as a local member, and try and bring it to the committee work, but it kind of just reinforces how challenging it then is for bodies like the Reserve Bank and the Council of Financial Regulators in trying to navigate how we move forward as a system as a whole.
I think that's fundamentally important, is who are the consumers, and it's not just individuals, it's businesses as well, and it's a whole, everyone has a different view and a different perspective and a different place within that society. I think we're probably getting close to time. I think the key thing we can take away out of this discussion is collaboration is fundamental, but collaboration is not just about putting forward a submission when there is an inquiry or going and being able to put forward a view from an industry perspective to a regulator. It's actually about what are all of the different avenues available? How do we present things in a way that is data-driven? And how do we actually focus on solving the problems at hand, which is something that FinTech as an industry, whether you are in the banking end or in the startup end or somewhere in the middle with some of the giants of the sector, has an incredibly important role to play. And I think government is incredibly thankful for that role as well. So can you join me, please, in thanking our amazing panel, Rhonda, Daniel and Michael.